Texas. I want to thank each of you for joining us tonight. I just want to ask you that you silence your microphone during the presentation so that we don't have any kind of static that might prevent us from getting the full benefit of tonight's talk. We're going to have a Q&A at the end, so I would just ask as things come up that you would just write your questions in the chat box, and I will address those at the end of our presentation. I'll allow the last 15 minutes for a Q&A time. And then I'm also going to place a survey at the end. So if you can fill that out, I would really appreciate it. And if you have any further questions after we're finished with this topic, feel free to email me. It's greta@edenscounseling.com. And again, I just thank you for attending. Before we kind of jump into the inner critic and self-compassion, I just want to introduce myself. I am a social worker by degree. I am very passionate about the topic of the inner critic and self-compassion. Spent many, many years in that negative space, that debilitating place where the inner critic was not helpful. And I have learned over the years to develop a life of self-compassion. At Edens Counseling, I work with couples and families and individuals, and this is generally part of my work with them. It's a part of my work that I really enjoy, seeing people being set free from the inner critic and its harshness. So let's just get started. So our objectives tonight will be defining the inner critic, identifying the inner critic, developing self-compassion, and then we're going to take a look at some practical application. And I am going to try to not talk too fast. My inner critic would say, slow down, you talk too fast when you get nervous. And there's always a part of me before presentations that have a little bit of my anxiety shows up, sometimes more than I care to like. And of course, because I do have an inner critic like the rest of you, when I was working on this presentation, my inner critic, the first thing it wanted to say was, what business do you have doing your presentation on the inner critic? And I politely shut my inner critic down and said, I have a lot of experience with you. So these will be our objectives. And we want to define the inner critic. It is a psychological concept of the inner voice that demeans and judges us. It's a voice in our head that constantly criticizes, belittles, judges. I also like to think of it as like this parrot on our shoulder that's being very critical. Or when I work with children, I will have them draw their inner critic. If that's something that you think would be helpful for you, I would invite you to do that. It's really interesting how children will, the cartoon characters, kind of these obscure figures that their inner critic looks like. So for you to decide, what does your inner critic look like? It's also referred to as a judger, a saboteur, and as Freud's work brings into the superego. Typically, our inner critic has a harsh voice, a very harsh tone, unloving, not inviting, lack of empathy and compassion, very negative self-talk. And again, like the parrot, this relentless, destructive chatter. So the psychology of the inner critic. Most psychologists agree that the roots of our inner critic occur in our childhood. Again, looking at Freud, we internalize our external view of self, the way our parents looked at us, the way our caregivers perceived us, coaches, teachers, those primary figures in our life that could be criticizing, right? the superego. It's cruel, unforgiving, punishes. We begin to deem ourselves as unworthy. We see the world as having that same view. It's hard for us to think that if other people, my primary caregivers, have kind of this negative view or critical of me, surely the whole entire world looks at me the same way. And what ends up happening is we end up spending most of our psychological energy on this inner warfare, trying to battle between how the external and the internal align or don't align. And because we're in this warfare, we have little energy left for the most meaningful parts of our lives, our friends, our family, relationships. So this little girl, she's adorable, right? This is before she realized that it's a hostile world out there. People criticize us, people drive us to be our best, and maybe they say things in a negative way to try to get us to achieve that. She's like, I'm awesome, I'm the best, like my mommy and daddy love me, everyone's here for me, they think I'm great. She hasn't had that experience yet where someone's criticized her or said something harsh, where she's starting to internalize and think, what's wrong with me? So the development of the inner critic, it's located in that survival part of our brain that's tasked with physical survival, that place where we go into flight, fight, freeze response. It involves the amygdala and the limbic system. It regulates our emotions. It originally had a function of keeping us safe, keeping us from danger, keeping us from making mistakes, helping us stay motivated toward our goals. And then as children, we internalize the external world around us. And instead of placing responsibility on our critical parents or coaches or teachers, we turn the criticism inward. It's like we look to those people, right? Our parents, our grandparents, those primary caregivers of being our source of survival, our source of safety. And when that happens, we as children cannot put responsibility on them for their behavior. And so we begin to internalize and say, oh, I must be bad. I must be naughty. What's wrong with me? My own personal experience as a child, I grew up in a home where my mom was, a perfectionist, to say the least. And we had chores. Those chores could range from washing the dishes to ironing to cleaning the house, and nothing ever quite met her expectations. And so she was very quick to let us know that. And the child that I was, maybe I took that in more than maybe some of my siblings. But my mom would say, you need to re-iron this, or you need to wash the dishes again, they're not quite right, or redust that table. And so I began to look at myself as unable, incapable, less than perfect, and none of us are perfect. And so what happened, and we'll talk more about this, how this internalization can become very debilitating for us as adults. And so what happened for me as a child, hearing these constant criticisms, I began to people please. I wanted to please my mom so much. I wanted her to be proud of me. I wanted to be perfect. I wanted to do things perfectly, have good grades, again, get this validation. And so I wasn't able to process that as a child. So what may be a survival mechanism in childhood, like protection, right? I was protecting myself through behaviors like perfectionism and people pleasing, becomes a debilitating handicap in adult. As an adult, we cannot live our lives that way. So this young boy has realized that not everyone thinks I'm awesome and great and the best. And so he's starting to internalize these negative transactions with caregivers. And he's like, I'm naughty, I'm bad, I'm fill in the blanks. Think of maybe your own personal experience with maybe a primary caregiver or teacher or coach that has played a role in your inner critic and the way that you view yourself. So what you may hear from your inner critic is you aren't talented enough to fill in the blank, talented enough to be in this position at work, talented enough to try out for a drill team. When I was in ninth grade, we moved to a new town, and I wanted to be a part, right? As any adolescent, like, how can I feel included? I decided to try out for the drill team. And I can tell you, anyone who knows me would tell you now that I do not have those skills. It was an experience for me where I wanted to do that. And my inner critic actually was trying to spare me of the humiliation of that experience, but I didn't want to hear that. And so I didn't make drill team. And then again, I began to formulate this part of my inner critic where it's like, oh, I'm not good enough, I'm not talented. And I took that extreme to, I'm not talented at anything, I'm not good at anything. Another thing you may hear is, you're going to screw this up. How many times have we failed at something and someone's like, you did it again. And so we're internalizing that and we're saying that to ourselves. Our inner critic is partnering with us in those words. Or maybe you're a parent and you're frustrated with your child and maybe you yell. Maybe you have a behavior that you're not proud of. Maybe you spank your child. And all of a sudden you're saying, good moms don't, good dads don't. And you're, this place of shame that your inner critic is then aligning to let you know that you're not enough, you're not good. Or maybe you've decided you want to go to grad school, some lofty university, and your inner critic is saying, who do you think you are? Maybe you want some position at work and your inner critic is saying, who do you think you are? You're not capable of that. Or your inner critic is saying, you'll never get that position. You'll never get that raise. You're an idiot. You always do this. You always apply for things that you're incapable of. You aren't good enough to fill in the blank. You aren't good enough to apply for that university. You aren't good enough to get that raise. You aren't good enough to try out for the drill team. You aren't good enough to be a cheerleader. You aren't good enough to be accepted. You aren't good enough to be in a relationship. Just all that negative talk that our inner critic does. They're going to find out you are a fraud. And we call this the imposter syndrome, right? We see this with therapists. We see it with teachers. We see it with CEOs. We see it with managers. And because our inner critic has undermined our qualities and our strengths, so we begin to doubt our own capabilities. Or maybe as a child, you hear you're lazy. And so that voice continues to resonate with you. You oversleep at work one day and you're late for work. And all of a sudden you hear your inner critic saying, you're lazy, you're never going to get a promotion, you're going to lose your job. So all these things are very negative that your inner critic is saying to you. So here we have this young woman, maybe she's in a conference, maybe she's a speaker, she's with her colleagues and she's saying, who am I to think I belong with this talented group of people? I don't belong here. My colleagues are going to recognize I am out of my league. Again, the imposter syndrome. I don't belong. And all of this voices start in our childhood. So the inner critic and anxiety. There are many, many studies on the link between anxiety and this strong inner critic that we have. The inner critic has a power to make us feel constantly anxious. Again, that hypervigilance that occurs, that fight, flight, or freeze mode, can constantly point out danger to our physical and mental health. So your inner critic may be saying, oh, shouldn't do this because this is going to happen, not looking at all the possibilities that could happen. It's like, no, this is going to happen. This is going to happen to your physical health. This is going to happen to your mental health. Constantly looking at the negative, not looking at, again, all the possibilities and the positives that can happen. It may involve catastrophic thinking, this place of the worst. What's the worst that could happen? It's going to go there. Our anxiety will drive that, and it will partner with our inner critic. This exaggeration, right? It's the worst. It's the worst day ever. It's always never. And emphasizing the bad and minimizing the good. So let's say you get a promotion at work, but you don't get the raise to go with it. Your inner critic will drive home that you did not get the raise. You only got the position. So the position may have been something really wonderful, such an honor, highly esteemed within your work, and you're focusing, you and your anxiety are partnering and focusing on minimizing the importance and value of that, and focusing on the number, the salary. Our anxiety and our inner critic also drives us to want to take premature action to calm ourselves, right? Our anxiety will tell us that something has to be taken care of right now, this minute. Instead of taking a breath and realizing, no, inner critic, my anxiety is just speaking to me. I need to, become calm. I need to relax. I need to allow myself to not partner and believe that I have to take care of this minute. You can also engage in paranoid mind reading. Okay, so what happens is we believe that negative thoughts and actions of others are equal to how we view ourselves and how our inner critic views us. So we have to be careful that we're not making assumptions that other people are having those same feelings and attributing these negative thoughts to us, right? And so the other thing is we want to live in constant expectation of punishment. We're waiting for that shoe to drop. We're waiting for that breakup. We're waiting for the loss of love. We're waiting for abandonment. And so we're constantly expecting some kind of loss or punishment, some type of abandonment. And then we have this relentless focus on the what ifs. What could go wrong? Instead of thinking of what can go right. What are the good things that could happen? It's like we have this tunnel vision into the negative. So we want to identify our inner critic. I am going to read these slowly. I want you with each question to just sit with yourself and see what comes up, like what you find out about yourself and your inner critic in this process. So again, I'm going to try to read those really slowly and just give you a moment to process and think. the first thing we want to do when we're identifying our inner critic is to be curious about ourselves. You know, it's always great to be curious about others, and it's equally wonderful to be curious about ourselves. So the first question would be, what parts of yourself, what part of your life are you most critical of? And how does that criticism manifest? Do you try to understand your limitations? What does that self-criticism feel like? Does it feel like to your spirit? What type of language do you use? Is it harsh? You cuss at yourself? What's the language? Is it negative words? Are they positive affirmations? What's your tone? Is it condescending, sarcastic, harsh, negative? And when you're engaging with your inner critic and he or she is speaking strongly to you, in that process, do you feel motivated or do you feel self-defeated? Would you allow others to speak to you the way that your inner critic may be speaking to you? What would you say to someone who speaks to you that way? And does your inner critic have a familiar voice? For me, growing up in this home where my mom was a perfectionist, I often hear her voice when my inner critic is speaking to me. My mom had many wonderful qualities, but a very high expectations and high criticism. And so this often will show up less frequently now, but certainly through my young adulthood, early adulthood, occasionally even now where I recognize her voice. And so whose voice do you hear? Maybe a coach, maybe a teacher, maybe a parent, a grandparent, but knowing like, where did this resonate? Whose voice am I hearing? Or maybe you're hearing your own, but being aware of that. So all of these things are really important when we're asking, who is my inner critic? Will help me identify. These questions are very relevant and will help you be able to do that. So talking to your inner critic. Once you recognize the voice of the inner critic and your self-criticism, just pause. When your inner critic is talking to you, whether you're at work or home or play with friends, just pause. I hear you. Take 3 deep cleansing breaths, like you're practicing mindfulness or you're practicing yoga. Just take that time. Just take that pause. And like acknowledge, I hear you. I'm going to breathe through this. And then notice what you say to yourself when you fail or make a mistake. Are there key phrases? Are you using these always, never, you'll never be enough, you'll never achieve, you'll never be successful, you'll never get in that program that you want to, you won't be the CEO, you won't be a manager. Yeah, you're lazy, you're stupid, you're an idiot. What are the phrases? And are they repetitive? Do they show up in those areas, those times when you are failing or making a mistake? And again, what is the tone of your voice? Is it harsh, angry, sarcastic, condescending? what's the voice? What's the tone that you hear? Is it pleasant? Is it cheerful, happy, encouraging? And then identify how you are partnering or agreeing with the judge, the saboteur. When I was probably 8, I came home from school, and my father was a big proponent of good grades. Grades meant a lot to him. And so I came home, like I said, probably at 8 years, and I had I think a B in math. And he was like, is this the best you can do? Questioning me, not being extremely harsh, but firm. And my mom jumped in, wanting to, I think, rescue in some way. She was like, oh, she's just not good at math. And so I started to internalize that. And I went into 4th grade, 5th grade. I think in 5th grade, I had a C. And I really struggled with math through my junior high and high school. And I think my first good experience with math, I was an undergrad, and I had an A in algebra. And I was like, whoa, maybe I'm not as bad at math as I thought. But I partnered through all those years. It was like, I would tell myself whenever I had a math class, like, well, you're just not good at math. And so my inner critic would tell me that in a loud voice, and I would also partner with that. So identifying with how you're partnering and agreeing with this judger, this saboteur, this critic, and how it's holding you back. I had an experience in undergrad, psychology major, and statistics. And you can just imagine, oh my gosh, I'm not good at math. Like, how am I going to pass statistics? And I kept having this like battle with my inner critics, like, you're not going to be able to do it. You're not going to be able to get your degree in psychology. You're going to have to figure out another major. You're not going to be able to go to grad school. Again, catastrophic thinking, right? But I'm partnering. I'm believing my inner critic that I'm not going to be able to do this. And I knew I had to pass statistics in order to get a degree in psychology. And so recognizing how all those years of listening to my inner critic, believing him, and I ended up passing statistics. I got a degree in psychology, and it was a battle. I was constantly battling, like, fighting it out. So again, where are you agreeing with your inner critic that you are something that you're not, or not capable of something that you really are? So we want to take action, right? We always want to take action. Think about what you would say to someone you love or care about. Pay attention to your tone. How would you like to talk to yourself? Practice using a kind, loving tone. There's an element of what our inner critic says that is true, but it's not the absolute truth. And so we want to use a kind, loving tone when we're with ourselves. Identify what you're criticizing yourself for. Take a learning stance. What can I learn from my inner voice? What is truth? Like, I wasn't great at math. There was an element of truth to that. But I wasn't that I couldn't do it. So what can you learn? What can you learn from your inner voice where you can accept certain parts of yourself that are true, but not taking it to the extreme? What part of your inner voice can you listen to? Can you trust? How can I use my inner critic's feedback as a motivator? Because my inner critic was saying, you're not good at math. You're not going to be able to go to grad school. You're not going to get a degree in psychology. What my inner critic sort of said is, it's not impossible. You are capable. You're going to have to work hard, right? And that's much more motivating than you can't do this, you're not good, it's never going to happen, these extremes. So how can you use that feedback as a motivation? How can I talk to myself like I would a child who's learning for the first time? So I think about bike riding, right? Child, you have your child, or you are a child and you're learning to ride a bike. You get on the bike, you're not just going to jump on, pedal, and go. Like probably the first few times teaching your child to ride a bike, they fall down. Do you scream and yell at them and tell them they're never going to be able to ride a bike? They're never going to be good enough to ride a bike. No, you're gentle and you're loving. And you say, sweetheart, it's okay. Dust yourself off. Let's go for this again. How can you approach yourself in this very same way, like you would your child, like you would your inner child? So, self-compassion. I am a lover of Dr. Kristin Neff. I have like my list of professors and that I love, and she is one of them. She is at the University of Texas in Austin, and all of her research, empirical, evidence-based, on self-compassion. If you're not familiar with her, I invite you, if you really struggle with showing self-compassion, to take a look at her work. It's very meaningful. It's been very impactful in my own life. So she says, unlike self-criticism, which asks if you're good enough, self-compassion asks, what's good for you? What do you need? So what is self-compassion? It's a positive attitude that we can have toward ourselves. It's an empirically measured construct. It's composed of self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. It's relating to ourselves in a way that is accepting, forgiving, and loving, accepting our flaws, forgiving ourselves for mistakes, and loving ourselves unconditionally. So self-kindness, one of the components of self-compassion, showing understanding and kindness when we fail at something. We're not going to do well at everything. It's impossible. We're not made that way, right? We have our strengths, we have our weaknesses. Understanding and being kind when those things happen, or even something that we're good at, being understanding if we don't show up our best. Recognizing the influence of self-judgment and the negative way that it can impact us. Treating ourselves with warmth and patience, right? Like I gave the illustration of the child on the bike. Treating ourselves with that warmth and patience that we would a child. Treating our worth as unconditional. I'm worthy regardless. Even when we don't meet our own expectations, much less the expectations of others. My worth is not based on my performance. Being tolerant of your shortcomings. Gosh, I mean, I have a list of shortcomings, and I always will. They will be there. Maybe the list might get shorter, might get longer, but really being tolerant of those and recognizing that that's part of the human condition. Being patient with my perceived flaws and shortcomings, knowing that they're there. Some of them are my own perception. If I polled other people, they might say, no, I don't agree with that at all. Like, you are good at this, or I don't perceive that as being a flaw or a shortcoming. Common humanity, recognizing that we are all part of something bigger. Viewing our own experience as being embedded in the broader human experience versus isolation and loneliness. So this lack of self-compassion, this strong inner critic can lead to perfectionism, as I addressed probably one of my greatest struggles through most of my life, along with people pleasing. And then it leads to shame. And so what happens in that shame and perfectionism is we isolate, we avoid, we don't reach out, we find ourselves not in relationship. And so if you're familiar with Dr. Brene Brown, I encourage you to take a look at her work on perfectionism and vulnerability and shame, because that shame that comes from partnering with our strong inner critic leads us to like isolate and be alone, and not realizing that every person is struggling in some way, and we all have an inner critic. Accepting and forgiving our flaws, realizing that we're not alone in our feelings of inadequacy or being imperfect. Each of us individually struggles with that, combats that, fights that. And viewing your difficulties as something that everyone goes through. Their difficulty may look somewhat different than yours, but in a place of our common experience, we each have difficulties. And recognizing that we all are there. So mindfulness, acknowledging and labeling our thoughts versus reacting to them. I teach a DBT group, and in that group, we talk a lot about our thoughts. And in the mindfulness practice of meditation and mindfulness, we often just address that our thoughts are just thoughts. We don't have to do anything to them. They are just thoughts. I don't have to react to them. I don't have to take care of them. I can let them float by, can let them just go on a conveyor belt. Whatever visual you can come up with that is helpful for you. Mindfulness is also the opposite of avoidance. Like if I'm being mindful, I'm leaning in, I'm being present. I'm also keeping my feelings in balance. So again, when we look at DBT skills and the work of mindfulness in our lives, feelings aren't facts. So reminding myself, these are just feelings. They're valid. My feelings are valid. They're important. But I need to balance those and recognize that they're not factual. And I have to act out on them because I have correlated them to some fact. I also need to maintain my perspective in this place of mindfulness. And then looking at my emotions with curiosity and openness, embracing my emotions, trying to understand why I'm having the emotions that I am, what's driving that, and what do I need. Tips for practicing self-compassion. You want to treat yourself as you would a friend. Would you want your friend to tolerate someone talking to them negatively like your inner critic does to you? Again, that curiosity, become more self-aware of yourself, your emotions. Gain perspective. Talk to other people about their own experience with their inner critic, where they've been successful, where they've battled, what they still struggle with. You can write a letter to your inner critic. You can write a letter to your inner critic and thank your inner critic for wanting to protect you, wanting to take care of you, but also letting your inner critic know that you're not going to tolerate the way that he or she addresses you anymore, that you've had it, like you've had enough, that you deserve compassion and empathy and kindness and kind words. It can be really helpful to do that letter writing experience, especially if you're struggling with this harsh inner critic that's creating anxiety and despair and really debilitating you in some way, preventing you from living a life that you really want. And practice the mindfulness. There are some great apps, Calm, Headspace, 10% Happier, and many, many more. In so many ways to bring mindfulness into your life. Use positive affirmations. Write them down. You can write them on your mirror, get up in the morning, getting ready for work, school, see them, write them. If you can't find anything good about yourself, ask your friends, ask your partner, ask your spouse, speak them, put them on a sticky note, stick them on your car. In your car, when you drive to work, you can repeat them. It's a great way to practice self-compassion, seeing the best in yourself. Keeping a daily journal. Again, I'm a huge fan of many of the professors at the University of Texas, Dr. Pennebecker, in the psychology department. And he has spent his life doing research on journaling. And I'm a firm believer that it's very impactful in our lives, very helpful. I think it's great when we're trying to practice self-compassion and also when we're struggling with difficult things. So keeping this journal of difficult events that come up and how your inner critic may be sabotaging you and helping you to look at those difficult events and processing them through this lens of compassion and empathy. So that is it. I've actually finished a few minutes early, but I am going to try to pull up the questions that you guys have asked. Yes, and so we'll address some of those. And if you want to add some, that would be great. So let's see. Let me see if I can find this. Sorry, bear with me. And I do want to apologize about the dog. He's a very old dog, and I know he was very annoying, and I'm sorry I didn't want to get up and go address him, so I do apologize for that. Okay, so the first question is, I've been taught in leadership seminars that one can assume one is at cause for what happens in the outside world, and thereby change one's own behavior for the better to get better results. I raised the point that it could lead to us feeling as if we are to blame for everything bad that happens. How do you reconcile these state affairs? That's a great question. I think that, let me just take a moment and kind of process that, because we can, as children, right, feel that we are at blame for everything that's happened, that our parents or caregivers or teachers, professors, coaches, that we're to blame for their disapproval. And yes, then we begin to internalize that. That becomes a strong inner critic. And we have to just recognize truth, right? I can feel that I'm responsible, but where are the facts? I can have these thoughts that I'm responsible, but those are only thoughts. And so I think, again, to look at your life, to look at your responsibility, because there are things we're responsible for, but there are many things that we aren't responsible for. And so recognizing that we can look at our lives and address the places that we are responsible, and also show compassion to ourselves for those places, but also identify that we aren't responsible for others and their actions. And I hope that that was helpful. Next question is, why is it that your inner, as your critic, like parent, etc., could tell you 1,000 good things you did, but you internalize the one critical thing, or the thing that you may have overheard them saying to someone else means so much more than what they said to your face? Great question. Yeah, why do we only hear that negative? I can't remember his name, and excuse me for not, I'm going to quote him, but he says, genetics load the gun, and environment pulls the trigger. And so quite possibly, maybe you're just that child who came here more sensitive. And so you internalize the negative things that were being said, and maybe those began to become a bigger part of your life. And so your inner critic then is telling you, focusing on the negative things that your parents have said instead of taking the good things that they've said, and focusing on those. I think that that is often what happens is we hear the negative, our inner critic attaches to it. And so you're hearing that repeatedly. And when your parents say, great job, good grades, affirm you, well done, you overlook that because you've now partnered with your inner critic and you're in this catastrophic thinking. You're in a place where you are believing the negative things. So how can you shut that inner critic down and begin to hear the positives, not only that your parents are saying about you, but the positive that others. How do you deal with the same family who reinforces your inner critic? I tend to isolate from them and then feel guilty. Yeah, that experience where we want to hide, right? The isolation that comes when our inner critic is so strong. And instead of wanting to show up and realize that this is all part of the common human experience. And so, there's a lot of ways that I could approach that, right? We have family dynamics. Oftentimes as adults, we can gather with our family members and we can all of a sudden feel like we're a child again, right? We're arguing with our siblings. We're like vying for parental attention. I often say in those experiences, how old do I feel? And so recognizing again where your inner critic started, how it may show up as that parent, that family member. And again, doing that individual work that is required of us to recognize our inner critic, and also, shutting that inner critic down, self-compassion, recognizing that we're all part of this common humanity, doing mindfulness, oftentimes addressing, right? I don't know your family. It's hard for me to kind of go down that path with you as to how to address those family members. But I think when we're doing our own inner critic work, we're less inclined, not that it won't ever happen, but as we begin that inner critic work, we're able to tolerate maybe the way that person is showing up and aligning with our inner critic. And I hope that makes sense and is helpful. How do you tell the difference between the inner critic and a very real need for self-improvement? How to identify what might really need to change versus just being self-critical? Okay, let's just identify there's probably in many areas of our lives room for improvement. I think asking yourself, how am I talking to myself about this? Is my inner critic addressing my needs for self-improvement that's motivating, and not talking to me in this harsh, awful voice? And I think that's when we can begin to note that I'm trying to find the words, sorry, that there's a need for self-improvement, right? It's like, okay, my inner critic is talking to me in this kind, loving voice. And I'm recognizing, yes, this is a need for self-improvement. Is my inner critic talking to me in this harsh way that I just feel demotivated and disempowered? And so I think try changing the way that your inner critic is talking to you. Begin to talk to yourself in this loving way and see if those areas of self-improvement feel like they're important and valuable and will improve your life. Okay, so what is it like to work with individuals with strong religious backgrounds who attribute their inner critic, at least partially, to negative spiritual forces? How do you integrate psychological concepts with their worldview? Whew, that is a great question, one that I don't feel completely qualified to answer. I think definitely looking at, of course, as a social worker, meeting our clients where we are. Very, very important, addressing their views and helping them to also see what else might be at play, how family members, how experiences in school, all the things we talked about earlier in the presentation that could also be contributing to this strong, harsh inner critic, that it might not just be a religious, and there can also be critical caregivers in the religious community, right? So just helping them see outside of that, like taking them to the work of combating their inner critic, recognizing it, also taking them to Kristin Neff's work and helping them to see that it could, yes, it could be some religious spirit or some spiritual force, but it can also be these other things, and helping them see that it's just not one or the other, all or nothing, that it could be this combination. All right, I realized that my siblings' voices, reinforces my inner critic for me as an outer critic. So avoidance is my current approach. Any suggestions? Yes, again, I think as we've discussed, as hopefully I've presented in a way that you could understand that this is our go-to, right? When we have a strong, harsh inner critic that results in high anxiety, shame. Shame keeps us from wanting to connect. And so as I do this inner critic work, I begin to recognize that it is my siblings' voices that I hear. And how can I, as I'm doing the inner critic work and showing up more compassionate, more empathic with myself, how can I lean into the relationship? And I would suggest that if you're not in some kind of individual therapy, maybe finding a therapist if you're in the Houston area. Certainly myself or other therapists that we have are completely qualified to do this work with you. Again, this is a very individual question. I think the base of the answer is begin to do the work on recognizing where this started, how you partner with it, how you're allowing it to be debilitating in your life, how it's creating more isolation for you. And then depending on the relationship that you have with your sibling, right? Maybe having a conversation about the inner critic, about what you're learning. The recording will be available. It will be available on YouTube. And so that will be how you'll access the recording. I guess that is all the questions that we have. So unless anyone else has any questions, I think Yes, another attendee just wrote that I mentioned Brene Brown. Yes, Google her TED Talk on vulnerability. It's amazing. It's like 10, 11 years old. She is like, I love her. I reference a lot of her work. She has the TED Talk on vulnerability. She also has a Netflix program. I think it came out last year, and it's kind of the compilation of all of her work. If you struggle with perfectionism, shame, I think her work will really resonate with you. She has some great books: Rising Strong, Daring Greatly, The Gifts of Imperfection. That book personally changed my life. I've read it several times. So yes, thank you, Suzanne, for drawing that to my attention. Yes, I would highly recommend, if you struggle in this place of shame and lack of vulnerability, that you definitely access her work. Does anybody else have anything else? Because we have a few minutes left, to be happy to answer some more questions. If anyone else has any comments or anything else that they'd like to add. Again, the talk will be available on YouTube. I do want to apologize again for the dog. He's definitely the outer critic, not the inner critic. I think someone wrote that, probably a really good representation of how loud our inner critic can be, and what it can often sound like. And so I'm going to try to upload the, oh, okay, wait, EMDR and the inner critic. I'm not an EMDR therapist, but definitely I believe that an EMDR therapist could work with you on the inner critic. And so I would ask, if you have an EMDR therapist, just bring this to their attention and ask them how they see the work of EMDR partnering in your work on the inner critic. Okay, so another question, at what point would you conclude that these approaches are just not working and you need another form of therapy like EMDR or related therapies? Okay, so yeah, I think if you're not seeing results, I mean, and again, this is a kind of a broad answer, and there can be many answers to this. I think that if you're not seeing success with, if you're working with the therapist and you're not seeing the success you need, I think, okay, is it that, you can ask lots of questions when we're doing therapy. And is this not the right form of therapy? Am I using CBT or DBT, or what form of therapy is my therapist using? And do we need to switch what we're doing? Do we need to go to EMDR? Certainly. What other therapies is my therapist? What other therapies does she use? And if not, what would she recommend? Like talking to her, talking through this, having an honest, open conversation. I always welcome that in my own work. If my clients feel that we're not making headway, what can we change? It's a great opportunity as a therapist for me to learn and grow, and also for my clients to get what they need, which is ultimately the most important thing. So I would encourage you to have those kinds of conversations, and also identify what the barriers are to maybe you moving forward. Is it your own work that you're resisting, or is it truly just this isn't the type of therapy that you need? So again, thank you all so much for attending. I really enjoyed talking to each of you. I wish that we had been able to meet in person. So thank you so much.